Hey guys, welcome back to Kali Plants. It's me again, Mark, and for today's video, we're gonna be talking about succulent flowers, and we'll also be including cacti flowers here in this video because some of my cacti are actually starting to produce blooms as well. And this is my sedum pachyphyllum that is already in bloom. You can see it's really beautiful. It's got these yellow flowers that point upwards, so it's really pretty. It's really stunning. I'm gonna be showing you a close-up look on these plant's flowers. So let me just play it here at the front. Okay, so just so you know, I'll be sharing with you 5 facts about succulent flowers, why they flower, what's the purpose of the flower, what benefits can we get from their flowers, and also if you should be concerned if your succulent is producing a bloom stalk. So we'll be talking about that, going over that in this video, so hopefully you watch until the end. So for starters, for our first fact when it comes to succulents flowering, there are actually 2 different types of succulents. There are those that are monocarpic, and then there are those that are polycarpic. So monocarpic succulents, those are plants that will flower and then they will die. One example of a monocarpic succulent I have here is this sempervivum. So you can see it's a very stunning succulent, but if it doesn't produce pups and if it starts flowering from the center of its rosette, it will produce this death bloom, so what other people call death bloom. So it will die if it doesn't produce pups on its sides, but if it manages to produce pups, then the plant can still live on from its offsets, but basically the main head that produces the flower will actually die. Other succulents that do this include aeoniums, agaves, and kalanchoes. So some kalanchoes like this particular kalanchoe, once it manages to mature and grow to its full size, it will produce these really big, really beautiful bell-shaped flowers, and then the main plant will die, and it can only live on through its offsets or through the babies that propagate from its leaves. So that's how the plant will continue to live on, but basically once it flowers, it's dead, it's gone. Now when it comes to echeverias, they are not actually monocarpic, they are polycarpic succulents, which means they can produce multiple flower stalks throughout their lifetime, but sometimes some echeverias will produce that. So for example, with this, our Echeveria elegans albicans. So I'm not saying that this is a plant that is susceptible to a death bloom, so not all echeverias are actually susceptible. Some are more susceptible to than others, but this one, if it produces a flower stalk from its central rosette, then that plant is already gonna be dying, and it can only live on from its offsets or from the pups that will grow on its sides. So if your echeveria started blooming from the center of the rosette, that is already a death bloom, and your echeveria will already die. But that doesn't always happen. That probably happens when the plant is in an extreme situation. If it's struggling to survive, it's really stressed, then it can probably produce a death bloom. That's what happens with echeverias, but they're not always susceptible to that. Yeah, basically death blooms on echeverias are very rare, so you can expect your echeverias to have a long life, but with your other monocarpic plants, so with the sempervivum, once it flowers, it's gone. So that's what you can expect from those different type of plants. Now other polycarpic succulents include sedums, stinkies, so we have here our staphyliad, and also cacti. Cacti can produce several flower stalks throughout their lifetime. Okay, much like this one, this astrophytum, so you can see that it's got a flower spike right now. I will probably show you a picture once it's blooming already. Now for the second fact when it comes to succulent flowering, different species of succulents will actually have different habits when it comes to flowering. So not all your succulents will flower at the same time. So you can see here, not all my succulents are flowering, but some of them are actually preparing to flower. I read one source that said that usually succulents will flower at around 4 to 6 years of age. So for example, if a plant is already 4 to 6 years of age, it can already produce flowers. But sometimes, some succulents can actually produce flowers much earlier than that, and some succulents will actually start producing while they are still young. So while they are newly propagated, some will actually just flower right away. And particularly with the staphyliads, even if they're still young, they can already produce a lot of flowers. You can see here in this one, it's already flowering. So I've also propagated some sapiliads, and even if they are still small propagates, they can already produce flowers. So they're very different depending on the type of succulent. If you're someone who wants to see your succulent bloom, you can actually give them more light so that you can encourage them to produce flowers when it is their time. Because with plenty of light, the plant has a lot of energy, so it can transfer that energy into blooming, into producing these wonderful, majestic flowers. Now, some succulents, I've also read this online, that they will only start producing flowers if they are very stressed, so if their condition becomes very extreme, if they're in a very extreme situation. And actually, it's not very rare to see a plant producing flower and then dying right away because the conditions it's in are not very good for the plant. So because it's stressed, it will already give all its energy to producing flowers. Now when it comes to the season when your succulent will be flowering, most succulents will actually start producing flowers when it is going into their growing season. So for example, if your Echeveria is already transitioning into its growing state, so for example, the months are getting warmer, it's already turning summer, then you can expect your Echeverias to bloom. And with sedums, if the months are getting cooler, then they will start producing blooms. But that is not always the case because you can see that this sedum here is already producing flowers and it's still in the middle of the summer. So it's probably producing a flower because it's very stressed. I recently had it repotted, and once I repotted it, it started producing this bloom stalk. So that's after I repotted it, which maybe gave me an idea that the plant is stressed. So it produced these tall flower stalks. Now with my other Echeverias, you can see here with this fantastic fountain that I recently planted, you can see it's producing a bloom stalk. So this one could probably be producing a flower because of the season it's in. It's already in the middle of the summer here in my place. Actually, most Echeverias and cacti will produce flowers at this time of the year. So you can see here, this is a Gymnocalicium that is already producing a flower. And this is my newly planted exotic, so it's already producing a flower stalk as well. So that's how Echeverias will look like if they're producing a bloom stalk. That's how the stalk will start out. It starts out as a tall stem that looks like it has a rosette at the middle, but then it will only grow longer and then it will arch downwards and it will produce these bell-shaped flowers. Now for the explanation why succulents will start flowering at their growing season, it's because during this time of the year, the seeds that they produce at that season will have the highest chance of success because the conditions are just right for seeds to germinate and to produce new babies, to produce new plants. So if it's already in the growing season, if the plant is already waking up from its dormancy, then it will start produce flowers as well. Now when it comes to flowering duration, how long will your succulents be flowering? This one, I find that it started blooming about weeks ago, and right now it's not even yet done blooming. So it can probably take about 2 to 4 weeks before the plant fully does its flowering. So before it produces all its flowers, and then the bloom stalk will already be very spent. So it can take about 2 to 4 weeks on this type of sedum. But some succulents will actually produce flowers much quicker than that. Some cacti actually can produce a flower for just a day, it will bloom for a day, and then by the next day it will already be gone. And some even rarer type of cacti, or those that are tropical cacti, particularly our night blooming cereus, so that type of cacti will actually produce a flower in the middle of the night, and then on the next day the flower will already be gone. So you can only enjoy the flower for one night on that type of cacti. So succulents really have a lot of different types of flowers, so they're as diverse as any other plants out there. Now on our third fact, when it comes to flowering, succulent flowers actually take energy from the main plant. So you can see here this one, I haven't touched it very much, but you can see here that it's already producing this really dried, really crispy leaves, even if it's still wet, even if it's still newly watered. So it will produce these dried leaves because really the plant is sending energy from its leaves into its flowers. So because it takes a lot of energy to produce these flowers, the plant can sometimes absorb its leaves so that it can retain that flowering. So if you don't want your plant sending energy into the flowers, you can just cut off its bloom stalks. If you're still rooting your succulent, if it's not yet established, you can cut it off. So I have here, for example, this fantastic fountain. Since this is still newly planted and I haven't even watered it, I don't want it to produce a flower because I want its energy to be focused on producing roots and on producing new leaves first before it starts flowering again, before it can continue with its blooms. So because if I let this one grow, it will lose a lot of its leaves and it might not root properly. So I will already be cutting out this plant. So this is what you can do. This is called deadheading, actually, removing flowers from plants. So this is called deadheading in the gardening community, if I'm not mistaken. So now the stub that you left on it will actually become crispy, will die, and then you can remove it later on once the plant is no longer focusing its energy on there. Now, it's not always necessary to deadhead your succulents, especially if they're already established and they are matured. You can let them flower for a little while, and even if you cut off their flower stalks, some succulents will just push through with new bloom stalks. So it can get kind of tiring if you try to remove all of your flower stalks on your plants. So for me, for example, for this one, since I still have a lot of sedum pachyphilum, I'm just letting this ride. I'm letting it flower out, and also I wanted to show you what it looks like when it's flowering. So this is how the plant looks. So I want to show you that, so I didn't cut it off, but maybe after this video I will be cutting off this bloom stalk because I think the plant not already looking great right now. So I think I want to preserve some more of its leaves, so I will be cutting this off later on. On the fourth fact, when it comes to these succulent flowers, they actually produce these bloom stalks so that they can be pollinated, they can be fertilized, and they can produce seeds. So that's the main reason why they produce these stalks, so that they can replicate themselves, they can reproduce themselves in the wild. Now, just so you know, some succulents are actually self-sterile, which means they can't pollinate themselves. So they cannot produce seeds on their own if they're just the only one flowering in your place. So the pollen in it will not be accepted by the plant's ovaries, if that's the name, if that's the right term to use for that. So the pollen cannot be accepted by its own plant, so it cannot produce seeds on its own. So you will really have to have other succulents blooming in your place at the same time if you want to pollinate these plants. So for example, this sedum, it's actually self-sterile, and some other succulents are self-sterile. Some cacti actually are self-sterile. You cannot pollinate them on their own, so you will need to have another cacti of the same type to pollinate with, so that you can produce seeds from them. But when it comes to sedums, graptopetalums, echeverias, and pachyphytums, they're actually polyphyletic, which means they can cross-pollinate with each other. So this sedum, if I manage to have it bloom at the same time with this echeveria, I can cross-pollinate them and produce a different type of plant with that. But not all succulents will do that. Generally, most succulents are monophyletic, which means they can only pollinate with species of their own kind or with plants at their own genus. So for example, with stapeliads, they can only probably cross-pollinate with other stapeliads of the same type, of the same species, so they will not cross-pollinate with other cacti. Same goes with our astrophytum. Actually, a lot of astrophytum collectors will cross-pollinate astrophytums with each other, but not every cross-pollination will be successful. Sometimes astrophytums will not accept pollens from species in their own genera. Even if they're the same genus, they will not readily accept pollen from other species. So not all cross-pollinations when it comes to astrophytums will actually be successful. But some succulents, some cacti, can actually self-pollinate, especially mammillarias. I've seen it more than once on my mammillarias that when they flower, they also produce these fruits after they flower, which means their flowers got pollinated. And I think that since they're the only ones that are flowering in my place, that they are pollinating themselves, so they are self-pollinating plants, so they can pollinate their own flowers even if there are no other mammillarias in their place, in their area. So which is why I think that is very good if you're trying to start succulents from seeds. So you can try buying mammillarias, so you can get seeds from that, because they can really produce seeds on their own. Now also, just so you know, hybrids of the same species are actually called cultivars. So we have our Echeveria elegans, which has a lot of different cultivars just from the same plant. So that is probably because the plant is pollinated with other elegans that has a slightly different look, and this cross-pollinating with the same species produce these really nice, really unique cultivars that are different from the main plant. So we also know that from our gymnocalycium, since we have a lot of different types of gymnocalyciums, but most probably they are already cultivated and they are of the same species. So they have very different looks, but they're the same species. So those are what you would usually call cultivars. Now when it comes to breeding with plants of different genera, so those are already called intergeneric hybrids. So for example, we have our sedums crossed with echeverias. Those are actually called sediverias. So that's already a different genus if you manage to combine these different type of succulents. So that's what we call intergeneric hybrids. Another use you can have for succulent flower stalks are actually for propagation. So you usually have these leaflets when it comes to our bloom stalk. So the plant can also produce leaves on its side, so you can take those leaves and you can propagate it. So I will be taking one now. For example, this leaf right here at the bottom, I can take that one out and I can wait for it to produce pups. So that's what you can do. Actually, another way to propagate your bloom stalks is a way that Mr. Chuck Cyril of Ceriscapades is always showing on his channel. He cuts off the bloom stalks of his Echeveria gibifloras and then he lets them root. And once the bloom stalks rooted up, it produces pups on its sides. So you can also expect pups to produce on bloom stalks of your succulents. Actually, a lot of times, Haworthias are actually featured on Facebook groups growing pups on their flower stalks. So Haworthias can actually do that since the flower stalks have a lot of energy coming into them, so it can actually produce pups on that. And agaves can also do that. So for example, an agave produces this very tall flower stalk, and if for example an accident happens to it and the flower on the top gets cut off, it can actually produce pups on its flower stalk. And once the flower stalk dies and falls over on the ground, the pups can root back again on the ground and produce new clumps of agaves. So that's what succulents do. If they produce pups, and if the stalks die and fall over, those pups will root and produce new plants on the side of the main plant. So I think it's a very nice adaptation of the plant that they can really duplicate themselves in the wild with flowers and also with their bloom stalks, with their very tall, long bloom stalks. Now for the fifth and final fact about succulent flowers can actually attract pests. So I've had this several times before. Actually, this one, this Echeveria albicans, I recently saved it from mealybugs because as it was flowering, I saw a lot of mealybugs climbing onto its flower stalk. Actually, this is the flower stalk that I took off that had a lot of mealybugs. So if you're one that doesn't want to see a lot of pests on your plant, and especially if you don't like the flowers of your plant, you can cut off their flowers so that it won't attract mealybugs, it won't attract scale, and also it won't attract aphids, because aphids can sometimes be attracted with the flowers, especially since the flowers are very bright and they are very fragrant for some insects. So if you don't want insects on your plants, you can just deadhead your flowers. So I think that's about all I can say when it comes to succulents flowering. I will probably do more videos like this focus on succulent flowers once I do my pollination. So probably in a future video, once I manage to get all my succulents established and they are already producing flowers, I can probably make some hybrids. If I can, maybe I will do a video on that soon. So please make sure to hit the subscribe down below so you won't miss that. And if you like the facts that I gave you, please make sure to hit the like. And also you can share this video with your other friends who are growing succulents also and who also have their succulents flowering right now. So I think that's about it for this video, guys. I will see you on the next one. Bye bye.